Hello, good evening. I am Dan, and tonight we are returning back to the famous J.R.R. Tolkien writing, The Hobbit. In it, I'll be sharing with you a special scene called Riddle in the Dark. In this story, we will learn about what happened and how differently life played out when Bilbo Baggins stumbled upon a slimy-looking creature, Gollum. Now, if you've ever watched the movie, or perhaps read the book, it may be important to note that some sentences or certain uses of English in this story can seem, shall we say, incorrect to a modern listener. But to maintain the true nature of this story, some grammatical inaccuracies have been carefully overlooked, as we intend to narrate this story just the way it was written. So, lie back, relax, and come along with me on tonight's sleep story, A Night of Riddle in the Dark. As Bilbo and the company of dwarves advanced upon the misty mountains on their way to reclaim their homeland, the climb was long and treacherous. A violent thunderstorm breaks suddenly, forcing them to find shelter. Luckily, two of the dwarves, Fili and Kili, found a cave at the side of the mountain where they camped for the night. While they were sleeping, Bilbo had nightmares which woke him up. He was regretting ever having to leave Bag End, where he had no troubles, to embark on this deadly mission. So he tried to escape and make way home. But something unexpected happened. The mountain started shaking, and a big crack-like hole opened in the cave wall. It was a goblin hole, and they all fell into it, trapped and tortured by goblins. The goblins carried the dwarves and the hobbit down into the mountain to a huge chamber where the great goblin sits. He demanded to know what the travelers are doing in his mountain. Thorin tried to explain about the storm, but one of the goblins brought forth the sword that Thorin took from the trolls, which he was carrying when captured. The sword was called Orcrist, the Goblin Cleaver, is well known among the goblins and is highly feared by the goblins. Because of this, the goblins got into rage, and the great goblin lunges at Thorin to eat him. Suddenly, the torches lighting the cavern went out, and the great fire in the middle of the chamber shined its sparks onto the goblins. In the darkness and confusion, a great sword flashed and stroked down the great goblin. Then a voice guided the captives out of the cavern, a great and majestic voice, which is from none other than Gandalf, who led the dwarves through the passages and deeper into the mountain. The goblins followed quickly after them, and one of the goblins catches up to the dwarf, Dori, who has been carrying Bilbo on his back. Bilbo fell off into the dark, struck his head on the ground, rendering him unconscious. At the bottom of that deep, dark tunnel, Bilbo awoke in an underground and secret world he had never seen before. It was like a chasm in the misty mountain, crawling worms and oozy smells. He was not able to see where to go or which way to escape to the outside world. He guessed as well as he could and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hand felt something cold and metallic. He wondered, wait a minute, it's a ring. And that was a turning point in his career, a very powerful ring that can make its wearer appear invisible to others. The ring corrupts anyone who bears it, but Bilbo, not knowing the mysteries behind the ring, put the ring in his pocket and continued on his way down the tunnel. Go back, he thought to himself. No good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward? Only one thing to do. On we go. So up he got and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him and one hand feeling the wall and his heart all of a patter and a pitter. On and on he went, and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, on and on, until he was very tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over it to the days beyond. He eventually walked into an underground lake, which he was unwilling to try to cross because he doesn't know how to swim, and he was afraid of the dangers which may live in the water. Then he discovered a tattered-looking creature named Gollum, who was originally called Smeagol. This creature lived at the bank of a lake in the tunnel, down into the dark, which was made of rocks and mud and cluttered with junks and bones. He was known to be unfriendly sometimes, a wretched little temperamental imp who would often grumble about talking to himself and in concern of what or whom to eat. One could easily count the number of hairs on his head, with a very few teeth left on his jaws, and no clothing to cover his skinny bones. He has a large, pale eyes that glowed in the dark, and occasionally makes a coughing noise that sounds like Gollum. He has two personalities, one fawning and obsequious, the other cruel and cunning. The two personalities argue and call each other precious. He often hunts fishes, goblins, and any type of meat he could find to eat. Bilbo watched him from a distance, hiding behind a rock, as the little imp feasts on a goblin, dancing and singing to himself. The cold, hard lands, they bites our hands, they gnaws our feet, for rocks and stones are like old bones, all bare of meat. Cold as death, without no breath, it's good to eat. Bilbo brought forth his sword and watched closely as Gollum bashed the goblin's head in with a rock as it struggles. And Bilbo's sword was not just any sword. It was his very own elvish blade, a majestic instrument built 2 sizes smaller than a regular sword. It was sharpened on both ends and glows when goblins are nearby. He sees his sword stops glowing as the goblin dies, but then Gollum has seen the glowing light and hide himself. Bilbo looked around to watch Gollum. He noticed Gollum was gone. He wondered. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island, sailing quietly towards Bilbo from one corner of the lake. Then suddenly the imp came upon him. "Ah!" He walked slowly to Bilbo. "Bless us and splash us, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast. At least a tasty morsel it'd make us, Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. The Hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came in his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eyes sticking out at him. While Gollum was still talking, Bilbo draws his sword and places it against Gollum's throat. "Back! Stay back! I'm warning you! Don't come any closer!" The imp cackled, coughed 3 times as he backs off.
It's got an elfish blade, but it's not an elf's. No, not an elf's, no. What is it, precious? What is it?
Asked the befuddled imp. My name is Bilbo Baggins, replied Bilbo. Gollum, who has lived in the tunnel for several years, has not heard anything like Baggins before. So he asked,
Bagginses? What is a Bagginses, precious?
I'm a hobbit from the Shire, Bilbo added. The imp jumped and laughed.
Oh, we like goblinses, batses, and fishes, but we hasn't tried hobbitses before. Is it soft? Is it juicy?
Gollum tried to attack Bilbo, and Bilbo quickly brought forth his sword and waves it at Gollum. Gollum hissed at him. No, stay your distance, said Bilbo. I'll use this if I have to. I don't want any troubles. Just show me the way, and I will get out of here.
Why? Gollum asked. Is it lost?
Yes, Bilbo nodded. I am lost, and I want to get unlost as soon as possible. Gollum laughed. Seems he was enjoying Bilbo's company.
Oh, we knows. We knows safe path for hobbitses. Safe path in the dark. Shut up.
I didn't say anything, Bilbo added, thinking Gollum was talking to him.
We wasn't talking to you. Well, oh yes, we was, precious. We was, replied Gollum.
Look, I don't know what your game is, but The word game rang a bell in Gollum's ears because he loves games so much, particularly the game of Riddle.
Games? Gollum shouted. Oh, we love games, doesn't we, precious? Does it like games? Does it? Does it? Does it like to play?
Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them, and sometimes guessing them, had been the only game he had ever played, with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago, before he lost all his friends and was driven away, alone, and crept down into the dark, under the mountains. Very well, said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree, until he found out more about the creature, whether he was quite alone, whether he was fierce or hungry, and whether he was a friend of the goblins. You ask first, he said, because he had not had time to think of a riddle. So Gollum hissed, What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows. Easy, said Bilbo. Mountain, I suppose.
Does it guess easy? Said Gollum while smiling. It must have a competition with us, my precious. If precious asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If it asks us and we doesn't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We shows it the way out, yes.
All right, said Bilbo, not daring to disagree, and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. 30 white horses on a red hill, first they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old one, too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do.
Chestnuts, Gollum hissed. Teeth, my precious. The answer is teeth, but we has only 6.
Then Gollum asked his second.
Voiceless it cries, wingless, flutters, toothless, bites, mouthless, mutters.
"Half a moment," cried Bilbo, who was still thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had once heard something rather like this before, so he thought for a few moments, and getting his wits back, he thought of the answer. "Wind, wind, of course," he said, and he was so pleased that he made up one on the spot. This, I believe, will puzzle the nasty little underground creature," he said to himself. "An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye," said the first eye, "but in low place, not in high place." "Sss, sss," said Gollum. He had been underground a long, long time, and was forgetting this sort of thing. But just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch would not be able to answer, Gollum brought up memories of ages and ages and ages before, when he lived with his grandmother in a hole in a bank by a river. "Sss, sss, my precious," he said. "Sun on the daisies, it means, it does." But these ordinary, above-ground, everyday sort of riddles were tiring for him. Also, they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry, so this time he tried something a bit more difficult and more unpleasant. "It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter." Unfortunately for Gollum, Bilbo had heard that sort of thing before, and the answer was all round him anyway. "Dark," he said, without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. "A box without hinges, key, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid." He asked immediately to gain time until he could think of a really hard one. This he thought a dreadfully easy chestnut, though he had not asked it in the usual words. But it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. He hissed to himself, and still he did not answer. He whispered and spluttered. After some time, while Bilbo became impatient, "Well, what is it?" he said. "The answer is not a kettle boiling over, as you seem to think from the noise you are making." "Give us a chance. Let it give us a chance, my precious." "Sss, sss," Gollum cried. "Well," said Bilbo after giving him a long chance, "what about your guess?" But suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago and sitting under the riverbank while his grandmother teaching him to suck. "Eggses! Ah," he hissed. "Eggses it is! Ha ha, Grandma taught us to suck them." Then he asked, "Alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking." He also, in his turn, thought this was a dreadfully easy one, because he was always thinking of the answer. But he could not remember anything better at the moment. He was so flustered by the egg question. All the same, it was a poser for poor Bilbo, who never had anything to do with the water if he could help it. I imagine you know the answer, of course, or can guess it as easy as winking. Since you are sitting comfortably at home and have not the danger of being eaten to disturb your thinking, Bilbo sat and cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. After a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself.
Is it nice, my precious? Is it juicy? Is it scrumptiously crunchable?
He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. "Half a moment," said the hobbit, shivering. "I gave you a good long chance just now."
It must make haste,
said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat onto the shore to get at Bilbo. But when he put his long, webby foot in the water, a fish jumped out in a fright and fell on Bilbo's toes. "Ugh," Bilbo said, "it is cold and clammy." And so he guessed. "Fish, fish," he cried. "It is a fish." Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as ever he could, so that Gollum had to get back into his boat and think. No legs lay on one leg. 2 legs sat near 3 legs. 4 legs got some. It was not really the right time for this riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry. Gollum might have had some trouble guessing it if he had asked it at another time. As it was, talking of fish, no legs was not so very difficult, and after that the rest was easy.
Fish on a little table, man at table sitting on a stool. The cat has the bones.
That, of course, is the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. Then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and horrible.
We have one for you, precious. One for you. This thing all things devours. Birds, beasts, trees, flowers. Gnaws iron, bites steel. Grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. Poor Bilbo sat in the dark thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he had ever heard told of in tales, but not one of them had done all these things. He had a feeling that the answer was quite different and that he ought to know it, but he could not think of it. He began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking. He sits on a piece of rock near the bank of the lake as he thinks about the riddle, rolling it back and forth between his mouth and mind. Word by word, he slowly repeats the riddle to himself. This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees. What does that even mean? He asked himself as he took a deep breath. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time! Give me time!" But all that came out with a sudden squeal was, "Time! Wait a minute! Time! Yes, the answer is time!" Bilbo shouted. Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that, of course, was the answer. Gollum was disappointed once more, and now he was getting angry and also tired of the game. It had made him very hungry indeed. This time he did not go back to the boat. He sat down in the dark by Bilbo. That made the hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits. It's got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes. Just one more question to guess. Yes, yes,
said Gollum. But Bilbo simply could not think of any question with that nasty, wet, cold thing sitting next to him and pawing and poking him. He scratched himself. He pinched himself. Still, he could not think of anything.
Ask us, said Gollum.
Bilbo pinched himself and slapped himself. He gripped on his little sword. He even felt in his pocket with his other hand. There, he found the ring he had picked up in the passage and forgotten about. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said aloud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle, and he was frightfully upset.
Not fair, not fair, he hissed. It isn't fair, my precious, is it, to ask us what it's got in its nasty little pocketses?
Bilbo, seeing what had happened and having nothing better to ask, stuck to his question. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said louder.
"Sss," hissed Gollum. "It must give us 3 guesses, my precious, 3 guesses."
"Very well, guess away," said Bilbo.
"Handses," said
Gollum. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had luckily just taken his hand out again. "Guess again."
"Sss,"
said Gollum, more upset than ever. He thought of all the things he kept in his own pockets: fish bones, goblins' teeth, wet shells, a bit of bat wing, a sharp stone to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think what other people kept in their pockets. "Knife," he said at last. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had lost his some time ago. "Last guess." Now Gollum was in a much worse state than when Bilbo had asked him the egg question. He hissed and spluttered and rocked himself backwards and forwards, slapped his feet on the floor, and wriggled and squirmed. But still he did not dare to waste his last guess. "Come on," said Bilbo. "I am waiting." He tried to sound bold and cheerful, but he did not feel at all sure how the game was going to end, whether Gollum guessed right or not. "Time's up," he said.
"String or nothing,"
shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair, working in 2 guesses at once. "Both wrong," cried Bilbo, very much relieved, and he jumped at once to his feet, put his back to the nearest wall, and held out his little sword. He knew, of course, that the riddle game was sacred and of immense antiquity, and even wicked creatures were afraid to cheat when they played at it. But he felt he could not trust this slimy thing to keep any promise at a pinch. Any excuse would do for him to slide out of it. And after all, that last question had not been a genuine riddle according to the ancient laws. But at any rate, Gollum did not at once attack him. He could see the sword in Bilbo's hand. He sat still, shivering and whispering. At last, Bilbo could wait no longer. "Well," he said, "what about your promise? I want to go. You must show me the way."
"Did we say so, precious? Show the nasty little Baggins the way out. Yes, yes. But what has it got in its pockets, eh? Not string, precious, but not nothing. Oh no, Gollum."
"Never you mind," said Bilbo. "A promise is a promise."
"Cross it is, impatient, precious," hissed Gollum. "But it must wait, yes, it must. We can't go up the tunnel so hasty. We must go and get some things first. Yes, things to help us.
Well, hurry up, said Bilbo, relieved to think of Gollum going away. He thought he was just making an excuse and did not mean to come back. What was Gollum talking about? What useful thing could he keep out on the dark lake? But he was wrong. Gollum did mean to come back. He was angry now, and hungry, and he was a miserable, wicked creature, and already he had a plan. Not far away was his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, and there in his hiding place he kept a few wretched oddments and one very beautiful thing, very beautiful, very wonderful. He had a ring, a golden ring, a precious ring.
My birthday present,
he whispered to himself, as he had often done in the endless dark days.
That's what we want now, yes, we want it.
He wanted it because it was a ring of power, and if you slipped that ring on your finger, you would be invisible. Only in the full sunlight could you be seen, and then only by your shadow, and that would be shaky and faint.
My birthday present. It came to me on my birthday, my precious.
So he had always said to himself. But who knows how Gollum came by that present? Ages ago, in the old days, when such rings were still at large in the world. Perhaps even the master who ruled them could not have said. Gollum used to wear it at first, till it tired him, and then he kept it in a pouch next to his skin till it galled him, and now, usually, he hid it in a hole in the rock on his island, and was always going back to look at it. And still, sometimes he put it on when he could not bear to be parted from it any longer, or when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish. Then he would creep along dark passages looking for stray goblins. He might even venture into places where the torches were lit and made his eyes blink and smart, for he would be safe. Oh yes, quite safe. No one would see him. No one would notice him till he had his fingers on their throat. Only a few hours ago he had worn it and caught a small goblin imp. How it squeaked! He still had a bone or two left to gnaw, but he wanted something softer.
Quite safe, yes,
he whispered to himself.
It won't see us, will it, my precious? No, it won't see us, and its nasty little sword will be useless. Yes, quite.
That is what was in his wicked little mind as he slipped suddenly from Bilbo's side and flapped back to his boat and went off into the dark. Bilbo thought he had heard the last of him. Still, he waited a while, for he had no idea how to find his way out alone. Suddenly, he heard a screech. It sent a shiver down his back. Gollum was cursing and wailing away in the gloom, not very far off by the sound of it. He was on his island, scrabbling here and there, searching and seeking in vain.
Where is it? Where is it?
Bilbo heard him crying.
Lost it is, my precious, lost. lost. Curse us and crush us. My precious is lost.
What's the matter? Bilbo called. What have you lost?
It mustn't ask us, shrieked Gollum. Not its business, no, Gollum. It's lost. Gollum, Gollum, Gollum.
Well, so am I, cried Bilbo, and I want to get unlost. And I won the game, and you promised. So come along, come and let me out, and then go on with your looking. Utterly miserable as Gollum sounded, Bilbo could not find much pity in his heart, and he had a feeling that anything Gollum wanted so much could hardly be something good. Come along, he shouted.
No, not yet, precious, Gollum answered. We must search for it. It's lost, Gollum.
But you never guessed my last question, and you promised, said Bilbo.
Never guessed,
said Gollum. Then, suddenly, out of the gloom, came a sharp hiss.
What has it got in its pockets? Tell us that. It must tell first.
As far as Bilbo knew, there was no particular reason why he should not tell. Gollum's mind had jumped to a guess quicker than his. Naturally, for Gollum had brooded for ages on this one thing, and he was always afraid of its being stolen. But Bilbo was annoyed at the delay. After all, he had won the game pretty fairly at a horrible risk. Answers were to be guessed, not given, he said.
But it wasn't a fair question, said Gollum. Not a riddle, precious, no.
Oh, well, if it's a matter of ordinary questions, Bilbo replied, then I asked one first. What have you lost? Tell me that.
What has it got in its pockets?
The sound came hissing louder and sharper, and as he looked towards it, to his alarm, Bilbo now saw two small points of light peering at him. As suspicion grew in Gollum's mind, the light of his eyes burned with a pale flame. What have you lost? Bilbo persisted. But now the light in Gollum's eyes had become a green fire, and it was coming swiftly nearer. Gollum was in his boat again, paddling wildly back to the dark shore, and such a rage of loss and suspicion was in his heart that no sword had any more terror for him. Bilbo could not guess what had maddened the wretched creature, but he saw that all was up and that Gollum meant to murder him at any rate. Just in time he turned and ran blindly back up the dark passage down which he had come, keeping close to the wall and feeling it with his left hand.
What has it got in its pockets?
He heard the hiss loud behind him, and the splash as Gollum leapt from his boat. What have I wonder? Bilbo said to himself as he panted and stumbled along. He put his left hand in his pocket. The ring felt very cold as it quietly slipped on to his groping forefinger. The hiss was close behind him. He turned now and saw Gollum's eyes like small green lamps coming up the slope. Terrified, he tried to run faster, But suddenly he struck his toes on a snag in the floor and fell flat with his little sword under him. In a moment, Gollum was on him, but before Bilbo could do anything, recover his breath, pick himself up, or wave his sword, Gollum passed by, taking no notice of him, cursing and whispering as he ran. "Wait, he didn't see me?" Bilbo uttered. What could it mean? Gollum could not see in the dark? Bilbo seized the light of his eyes palely shining even from behind. Painfully he got up and sheathed his sword, which was now glowing faintly again. Then, very cautiously, he followed. There seemed nothing else to do. It was no good crawling back down to Gollum's water. Perhaps if he followed him, Gollum might lead him to some way of escape without meaning to. "Curse it! Curse it! Curse it!" hissed Gollum. "Curse the Baggins! It's gone! What has it got in its pockets? Oh, we guess, my precious. He's found it. Yes, he must have my birthday present." Bilbo pricked up his ears. He was at last beginning to guess himself. He hurried a little, getting as close as he dared behind Gollum, who was still going quickly, not looking back, but turning his head from side to side, as Bilbo could see from the faint glimmer on the walls. "My birthday present! Curse it! How did we lose it, my precious? Yes, that's it. When we came this way last, when we twisted that nasty young squeaker. That's it. Curse it. It slipped from us after all these ages and ages. It's gone. Gollum." Suddenly, Gollum sat down and began to weep, a whistling and gurgling sound horrible to listen to. Bilbo halted and flattened himself against the tunnel wall. After a while, Gollum stopped weeping and began to talk. He seemed to be having an argument with himself. Sitting in the dark tunnel, he cried out with sorrow at the state of his affairs, having had yet another of his clever plans crumble to pieces. He wondered so long, twisting and turning, going over all the ways he could have lost his precious ring, for this enticing jewel was the apple of his eye. He felt his heart beaten briskly and prattled on about his misfortune for the rest of his life. "It's no good going back there to search, no. We doesn't remember all the places we visited, and it's no use. The Baggins has got it in its pockets, the nasty noser has found it, we says. We guesses, precious, only guesses. We can't know till we find the nasty creature and squeezes it. But it doesn't know what the present can do, does it? It'll just keep it in its pockets. It doesn't know, and it can't go far. It's lost itself, the nasty, nosy thing. It doesn't know the way out. It said so. It said so, yes, but it's tricksy.
It doesn't know what it means. It won't say what it's got in its pocket says. It knows. It knows a way in. It must know a way out. Yes, it's off to the back door. To the back door. That's it. The goblins will catch it then. It can't get out that way, precious. Gollum. Goblins. Yes, but if it's got the present, our precious present, then goblins will get it, Gollum. They'll find it. They'll find out what it does. We shan't ever be safe again. Never. Gollum. One of the goblins will put it on, and then no one will see him. He'll be there, but not seen. Not even our clever eyes will notice him, and he'll come creepsy and tricksy and catch us. Gollum, Gollum. Then let's stop talking, precious, and make haste. If the Baggins has gone that way, we must go quick and see. Go! Not far now. Make haste.
With a spring, Gollum got up and started shambling off at a great pace. Bilbo hurried after him, still cautiously, though his chief fear now was of tripping on another snag and falling with a noise. His head was in a whirl of hope and wonder. It seemed that the ring he had was a magic ring. It made you invisible. He had heard of such things, of course, in old tales, but it was hard to believe that he really had found one by accident. Still, there it was. Gollum, with his bright eyes, had passed him by, only a yard to one side. On they went, Gollum flip-flapping ahead, hissing and cursing, Bilbo behind, going as softly as a hobbit can. Soon they came to places where, as Bilbo had noticed on the way down, side passages opened, this way and that. Gollum began at once to count them. One left, yes. One right, yes. Two right, yes, yes. Two left, yes, yes. And so on and on. As the count grew, he slowed down, and he began to get shaky and weepy, for he was leaving the water further and further behind, and he was getting afraid. Goblins might be about, and he had lost his ring. At last he stopped by a low opening on their left as they went up. 7 right, yes. 6 left, yes, he whispered. This is it. This is the way to the back door, yes. Here's the passage. He peered in and shrank back. But we doesn't go in, precious. No, we doesn't. Goblins is down there. Lots of goblins is. We smells them. What shall we do? Curse them and crush them. We must wait here, precious. Wait a bit and see. So they came to a dead stop. Gollum had brought Bilbo to the way out after all, but Bilbo could not get in. There was Gollum, sitting humped up right in the opening, and his eyes gleamed cold in his head as he swayed it from side to side between his knees. Bilbo crept away from the wall more quietly than a mouse. Gollum stiffened at once and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He hissed softly but menacingly. He could not see the hobbit, but now he was on the alert, and he had other senses that the darkness had sharpened, hearing and smell. He seemed to be crouched right down with his flat hands splayed on the floor and his head thrust out, nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel that he was tense as a bowstring, gathered for a spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away, out of this horrible darkness, while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put its eyes out, kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him or tried to yet. And he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror, welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless, unmarked days without light or hope of betterment, hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled. And then, quite suddenly, in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leapt. No great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he jumped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air. Indeed, had he known it, he only just missed cracking his skull on the low arch of the passage. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed as the hobbit flew over him, but too late. His hands snapped on thin air, and Bilbo, falling fair on his sturdy feet, sped off down the new tunnel. He did not turn to see what Gollum was doing. There was a hissing and cursing almost at his heels at first. Then it stopped. All at once there came a blood-curdling shriek, filled with hatred and despair. Gollum was defeated. He dared go no further. He had lost his prey, and lost, too, the only thing he had ever cared for, his precious. The cry brought Bilbo's heart to his mouth, but still he held on. Now, faint as an echo, but menacing, the voice came behind. "Thief! Thief! Thief! Baggins! We hates it! We hates it! We hates it forever!" Then there was a silence. But that too seemed menacing to Bilbo. If goblins are so near that he smelt them, he thought, then they'll have heard his shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or this way will lead you to worse things. The passage was low and roughly made. It was not too difficult for the hobbit, except when, in spite of all care, he stubbed his poor toes again, several times, on nasty, jagged stones in the floor. A bit low for goblins, at least for the big ones, thought Bilbo, not knowing that even the big ones, the orcs of the mountains, go along at a great speed, stooping low with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage that had been sloping down began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed Bilbo down. But at last the slope stopped. The passage turned a corner and dipped down again. And there, at the bottom of a short incline, he saw, filtering round another corner, a glimpse of light. not red light as of fire or lantern, but a pale, out-of-doors sort of light. Then Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as fast as his legs would carry him, he turned the last corner and came suddenly right into an open space where the light, after all that time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine in through a doorway, where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins. Goblins in full armor with drawn swords sitting just inside the door and watching it with wide eyes and watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him, whether it was an accident or a last trick of the ring before it took a new master. It was not on his finger. With yells of delight, the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo, and forgetting even to draw his sword, he struck his hands into his pockets. And there was the ring still in his left pocket, and it slipped on his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud as before, but not so delightedly. "Where is it?" they cried. "Go back up the passage," some shouted. "This way," some yelled. "That way," others yelled. "Look out for the door," bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, armor clashed, swords rattled, goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry, to-do, and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had the sense to understand what had happened and to sneak behind a big barrel which held drink for the goblin guards, and so get out of the way and avoid being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by feel. "I must get to the door! I must get to the door!" he kept on saying to himself, but it was a long time before he ventured to try. Then it was like a horrible game of blind man's bluff. The place was full of goblins running around, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he had bumped into, scrambled away on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up, and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled, but he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed, and he stuck. It was awful. His buttons had got wedged on the edge of the door and the doorpost. He could see outside into the open air. There were a few steps running down into a narrow valley between tall mountains. The sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door, but he could not get through. Suddenly, one of the goblins inside shouted, "There is a shadow by the door! Something is outside!" Bilbo's heart jumped into his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through, with a torn coat and waistcoat, leaping down the steps like a goat, while bewildered goblins were still picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they soon came down after him, hooting and hallooing and hunting among the trees. But they don't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of the shadow of the trees, running quick and quiet, and keeping out of the sun. So soon they went back grumbling and cursing to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped from Gollum, the dark, scary tunnels, and the goblins.